school vouchers and everything else in Louisiana that's causing problems. And so thank you all so much for being here, and I'm thrilled to tell you about our fight for science in my home state and around the country. So Louisiana is addicted to creationism. Our first creationism law was thrown out in 1987 during the Edwards versus Aguilar trial, but we didn't stop there. Back in 2008, we passed a new law, the misnamed and misguided Louisiana Science Education Act, which makes us repeat offenders. This law allows creationism in the science class, but I won't lie, it's a really clever law. It never once mentions creationism or intelligent design in order to dodge court rulings like Edwards or the more recent Kitzmiller versus Dover, which invalidated intelligent design. Instead, it just is about critical thinking and academic freedom. It only allows teachers to bring supplemental materials into classrooms to critique scientific theories, like evolution, climate change, human cloning, and the origin of life. Now, that's what needs to be critiqued, because they're very, very controversial. Not to scientists, but to Louisiana legislators. And so, because of this law, science teachers in Louisiana could bring in materials that say, the Earth is 6,000 years old. We found a website which then they have a woman who testifies every year. This creationist homeschool teacher advertises using materials that say dragons were real and you can witness through dinosaurs in a science class. She says you can use this with the Louisiana Science Education Act. So that's sort of what could be allowed into this law. Of course, throughout the talking points defending this law, it's all about critical thinking. If we just need to think critically and critique science. This is all about helping science, helping evolution. Of course, you don't need a law to critique science, to help critical thinking in the science class, because that's the nature of science. You only need a law if you want to sneak non-science like creationism into the classroom. If a teacher brings in good supplemental materials, this law, regardless of whether this law exists, they'll be fine. No one's going to punish them. You only need this law to protect against bad supplemental materials in the classroom. And of course, it gets a little bit more blatant from just what can be allowed in. The legislative sponsor of this bill, Senator Ben Nevers, just let the cat out of the bag when it passed and straight out said, the Louisiana Family Forum, a local religious rights group and affiliate focused on the family, asked for this law because they wanted creationism in the class. So we have it from the sponsor. We have it from the governor who signed the law. Governor Bobby Jindal just said in April in an interview with NBC's Education Nation, he was asked about creationism in public schools, and he said, we have what's called the Science Education Act that says if a teacher wants to supplement those materials, if the school board's okay with that, if the state school board's okay with that, they can supplement those materials. And this is what he means by supplement. I've got no problem if a school board, a local school board, says we want to teach our kids about creationism, that some people have these beliefs as well. Let's teach them intelligent design. So he said it straight out on national TV what this law was for. And when the Louisiana State Board of Education originally wrote the rules surrounding the Science Education Act, they originally banned creationism and intelligent design because everyone knew what this law was for. That didn't go over well with the creationists, who went berserk and managed to get the state board to scrap those rules banning intelligent design and creationism. And so despite all this talk about critical thinking, it's quite clear what this law is for. It's for sneaking creationism into public school science classes. And creationism is not science. It doesn't fill the scientific method. You can't test it. You can't, if you could test it, you couldn't repeat those tests. In science, you test it, it's just an explanation for the natural world. You test it, you repeat these tests. There are specific conditions that if the test proves those conditions false, then you have to start over and start from the beginning again. None of this works for creationism. It works for evolution, but not for creationism. So it's not science. It doesn't belong in the science class. And teaching our kids creationism is going to confuse them about the scientific method and the nature of science. And if our students don't understand the scientific method, then they're not just going to struggle in biology where they got taught creationism. If they don't understand the scientific method, how are they going to do physics? How are they going to do chemistry? How are they going to do any other science? Because it'll mess up their entire understanding of what science is. And so the Louisiana Science Education Act, I've attacked on evolution, but it doesn't just threaten evolution. It also threatens climate change, the teaching of climate science. And that is also another major problem, and that's one we have all across the country. Some of y'all may remember the North Carolina bill, which basically outlawed using climate science to determine where to build buildings on their coast. Sort of problematic if we build infrastructure that's going to be underwater because we don't believe in the science. Anyway, we have to fight to prevent the damage that these politicians are doing to science. And that's what I've been doing. For the last 3 years, I've been fighting creationism in Louisiana, in the Louisiana Science Education Act. As a high school senior, I knew this law was wrong. I knew someone had to take it on. And I thought an adult would do it. And so I waited when the law passed. I waited a year. I waited 2 years. And by the time I was a senior, I realized no one was standing up and fighting this law. And I knew it was wrong. I knew I might leave state very soon. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to actually take it on if I didn't do it now. So I decided to stand up and launch or repeal this law. The first step was to find a mentor, and that was Dr. Barbara Forrest, a world-renowned expert on creationism and intelligent design. She was an expert witness at the Kitzmiller trial, if anyone's seen Nova, the Nova movie about Kitzmiller. She was an expert witness there, and luckily for me, she lives 25 minutes down the road in Livingston Parish, a local hotbed of creationism, which, by the way, Livingston, when the law first passed, their school board decided this law was for, quote, critical thinking and creationism. And they didn't want a court case, but one of their school board members said they would be willing to take one for Jesus and stand up and teach creationism in the classroom. They wanted a religious teacher in the science class to teach creationism under this law. So they made that quite clear. And so she lives there, and I started meeting with her, and we got started fighting this law. The next step after that was to find a legislative sponsor of the Louisiana Science Education Act. Now, we got good and bad news on that, which is only 3 legislators in the entire Louisiana legislature voted against the Louisiana Science Education Act when it first passed. The good news is we knew exactly where we needed to go to start off. So the first person I went to, Senator Karen Carter Peterson, got a meeting with her, sat down and started explaining this law is bad, it needs to be repealed. And she cut me off and said, you don't need to tell me that, when do we get started? And so we went from there. And the first year, we went in committee and everyone told us we're gonna lose. This is the Louisiana legislature, they're notoriously backward, you have no chance. And you know what, we went in there and lost 5-1, partially thanks to this woman who led the charge against us, and we played this video.
I think most of the kids here would like to stand for is, if you had asked, would you prohibit this?
It wasn't what I asked.
I know.
And I am an attorney, and I listen patiently to all the accolades that everyone has behind, all the little letters behind their name, doctor, etc. So as an attorney, I'm asking a question, and I would like an answer to that question. Do you support, since you came to the table, do you support a law that prohibits the teaching of religion in the classroom?
Not in classes like English or history or comparative religions or philosophy class.
So you support the promotion of religion in an English class?
The Bible is always used in most English classes because it's a classic piece of literature.
Okay.
And promotion would be the key word in response.
Yeah.
Promotion would be, I mean, just if I could respond.
Go
I
ahead.
did listen patiently, and I appreciate that, Senator Quinn. And the only point I was trying to make is that if you wanted a response to your question, somebody needed to come to the mic so it could be on the record what the response was. And I don't think that any one individual, even Mr. Copland, can speak for everyone in the audience, and that probably...
That's kind of why I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
after listening to everyone, it seemed pretty clear that what they were espousing as a general concept was what they consider religious references as to creationism not being taught in the classroom. So I was rephrasing it. Then do you support a bill that prohibits the promotion, the teaching of religious beliefs in the classroom?
Well,
And they wouldn't even answer that.
Well, they weren't at the table, number one, but I don't think that, I mean, the instrument before, Senate Bill 70, deals specifically with creationism in science classes, and that's why you see the plethora of people with little letters behind their name.
Big letters. I wasn't trying to be
Well, I just heard little letters,
disrespectful.
and I'm very respectful of over 40 Nobel laureates. I'm very respectful of the Association of Biology Teachers. I'm very respectful of Louisiana Association of Biology Educators. I'm very respectful of Louisiana Science Teachers Association. I'm very respectful of the American Association of Advancement of Science, and I'm respectful of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, as well as American Society for Cell Biology and the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology. Lastly, the American Association of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Half of this stuff I can't even enunciate, and yes, they have little, big, medium, and big letters behind their names, and they're all suggesting that we repeal the act.
That was Senator Peterson delivering a smackdown to, thankfully, former Senator Julie Quinn, who led the charge against us the first year. She's now retired, luckily. And so the next year, the legislature evolved. We came in there, we lost the first time. Everyone told us, you're going to lose. And they said, why are you coming back the next year? And so anyway, we came back the next year. And they went from doubting people with little letters behind their names to something a little bit different, doubting evolution as a whole. So I'll show you this. oops, wrong one, sorry. This one.
Let me ask you a question. There's not an experiment that you could
Yes, there is an
have
experiment.
in the classroom that would say, here's Darwin's theory of evolution,
There
and
is
this
an
proves it without a
Yes,
shadow of a
I
doubt.
will tell you about that. They have done experiments with E. coli bacteria, and they have taken those E. coli and they have taken different containers of it and they froze them in time, so that
How long of a time? How long?
they just froze them over a generation, like years.
Oh, okay.
But this is an experiment.
Okay.
And so then they let the E. coli that are in the different vials continue to evolve. And then they take this group and they freeze it. And then they take this group and they freeze it. And then you can take all of them over time and compare them. And you can see how the E. coli have changed over time and how they evolved. But what's really
They
interesting...
evolve into a person? Okay, I'm just asking how to get there. I'm just trying to figure out how to get there. So go ahead. I mean, so they change. I think that's what we're talking about on...
Oh, that's not what we're talking about.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. I'm
We're
just
talking
trying to
about
find out.
evolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these E.
How we got
coli
here.
have...
So, again, a reminder, they're all elected, by the way. And so that year was better. We did evolve in one way. We only lost 2-1, not 5-1 that next year. And so the third year, this May, we only lost 3-2. It was the best vote we've ever gotten. But we did have an interesting twist. And I'll show you this.
Concerned that we might shut off the presentation of ideas by
We have that.
prematurely
Yeah.
declaring one science or another science as pseudoscience. This doctor practiced in an open circle in a dusty spot. He wore no shoes, was semi-clothed, used a lot of bones that he threw around. I would bet that all of us would agree that his science is a pseudoscience. We would not have respect for his science and the practice of his science. That would concern me, because if we were able to declare what I have verified for myself as something that has some validity to it. I mean, the stuff the man told me about my history.
Yeah.
Yet, if I closed my mind,
Yeah.
when I saw this man in the dust, throwing some bones on the ground, semi-clothed, if I had closed him off and just said, that's not science, I'm not going to see this doctor, I would have shut off a very good experience for myself, and actually would not have discovered some things that he told me about what I needed to go and do when I got home to see my doctor.
Wow.
He was headed in the right direction, and he just went the other way.
Apparently, evolution is not the only controversial thing in Louisiana. Apparently, also modern medicine. So, that's where we are today with the Louisiana Science Education Act. And you'd think with this creationism law, and maybe even a witch doctor law, Bobby Jindal had done all he could do to harm science education in Louisiana. If you think that, you'd be wrong. Because last spring, we passed a school voucher program, which allows public money to go to private schools that teach things like the Loch Ness Monster is real and disproves evolution, scientists are sinful men, and students must defend creationism against traditional scientific theory. And that's just in Louisiana. School vouchers are all across the country. Hundreds of millions of public dollars are going to private schools that teach that. My favorite school is one that calls Evolution the Way of the Heathen. And there's a school in Indiana, multiple schools in Indiana actually, which drive their kids down to Kentucky to visit the Creation Museum as field trips. And these schools are all receiving public money. And so initially in Louisiana, we found at least 20 private schools, most likely a lot more, that just weren't as blatant and didn't put things like scientists or sinful men on their website. But there are at least 20 schools that were originally slated to receive about $11 million. Found schools that were talking about speaking in tongues and all sorts of stuff. And so they brought the program down after that came out and made it about $4 million in its first year. So only at least $4 million are going to creationist schools in Louisiana. And they've expanded that since then to the second year of the program. But it's 300 schools plus across the country are teaching creationism through school vouchers. And these programs are marketed as just, they say there's accountability for these schools because of the free market. Now, that's, sure, the free market does determine where people go, but they don't do it on things like academic, like standing. Some of it's like, I want to go to the school that teaches my kids the Loch Ness Monster is real. And that's not competition we want. But the problem is these programs exist across the country. In Oklahoma, in Louisiana, in Florida has one with 20,000 students and over $100 million sent to it every year. And they're introduced all across the country each year. We managed to stop it in Texas again. And so this is one of the new things we need to fight beyond just laws like the Louisiana Science Education Act, which are loopholes. They're now blatantly giving money to creationism. And so this is one half of the science problem we have in America, teaching science denial. The second half is we're cutting science funding. We've cut $50 billion over the next 5 years from the US science budget, and we're cutting $80 million over 10 years. And this is not in a decade that's been increasing science funding. We've been pretty much stagnant for a decade. We've had one boost in the stimulus funding for science, and that was it over the last decade. So we've decimated science funding. And so if we're not teaching our kids science, and we're not funding science, where are we gonna be in the next 50 years? Because that's gonna be a problem. So what I'm calling for is a second giant leap. I wanna see a reinvigoration of science funding, and I wanna see our kids taught real science. And this is not gonna be an easy fight, because we're fighting against people like Senator Walsworth, who doesn't think that evolution happens unless E. coli's turn into people, or Senator Quinn, who just doesn't like those people with little letters. I mean, why do we fund them if they're just people with little letters who've done things like built the computer, created modern medicine? We don't like those little letters. Anyway, so it's not gonna be an easy fight, but as President Kennedy said when he launched the first revolution for science, and he put us on the moon, he said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. This is not going to be easy, changing the climate of science denial and anti-science in America, but it's one we have to do. Because if we don't, we really have a choice of two futures ahead of us. In one, we keep our present track. We let science funding continue to decline. We keep teaching our kids that climate change and evolution are not real. And we say goodbye to science. Or we have the second one, where we reinvest in science, $1 trillion of science in a decade. I would love to see that, because it's an investment. And $1 trillion sounds scary to a lot of people, because it's a large amount of money. But here's the thing about this type of massive investment in science. When you start a company, you take out a loan because you expect it to pay itself back. When you go to college, you take out a loan because you expect it to pay itself back. When you invest in science, you spend the money because you expect it to pay itself back. They just did an analysis on the Human Genome Project, and they said they spent $14.5 billion to fund the project. The US government received $59 billion back in tax revenue from the project. So the US government already paid for the project 4 times over for itself in new revenue, and then generated $1 trillion of economic activity. So that's why it's a long-term investment. That's actually, anyone who complains about the deficit, the way to pay it off is we invest in science, and we make smart economic choices by thinking long-term. So I got in a bit of an argument with Stephen Moore of the Wall Street Journal over this on Bill Maher, and he sort of doubted why we would fund any science, like snail sex research, for example. Now, it turns out this research helps about 250 million people in the developing world. I didn't know that at the time, but what I did know is he wasn't a scientist, and I reminded him of that. And so that's a good point to make to anyone who is doubting science research. It pays itself off you can't predict what will happen with it. Who could have predicted how we would have created the internet, and our entire economy today is based off that? So if you're not a scientist, who are you to dictate what funding is for science? And the good thing about science also is what we discover, unlike a road, we have to repave roads. We have to rebuild bridges. But when you discover something in science, that research will always be with us. So it's one of the best long-term investments we can ever make. And this is really what we have to do. We have to have a second giant leap. We have to reinvest in science. We have to fight these anti-science laws like the Louisiana Science Education Act, like school vouchers, and make sure kids are learning real science. And I hope you all help me in this fight. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'll take any questions I have in the next 5 minutes.
I've got to ask, the guy that Wall Street Journal gentleman from the Wall Street Bill Maher, after the episode was filmed, like, did he have any ill will towards you? Was he pissed off? Was he, because that was, first off, that was fucking hilarious. Any of you have not seen that, he just shuts him down. It was fantastic. But was he pissed off? Was he...
Luckily, he had no ill will. It was like, he had a good sense of humor about it, and so that was the good news about it.
I care with this.
Yeah, I guess so. I know.
But yeah, I just want to say that was awesome.
A couple more questions?
I was curious if there are other sort of student or high school activists that you've been able to coordinate with in other states, or identify, that come out thanks to you, or talk about that a little bit.
So I haven't actually worked with that many student activists. I usually work with the National Center for Science Education, talk to them probably every day, and the Americans United for Separation of Church and State are the big ones. Although one student activist I just learned about, I've never talked to her, but is Isha Marwaha, who's actually in Britain fighting to make sure they keep climate change in their standards, because they're having a problem with that right now. And so I haven't really worked with many student activists, but there's a few more out there. What I may do, if we run out of questions after this one, I'll show you another video of one of our legislators. 15 seconds.
So what do you think? I mean, it's one thing to have such opposition from economists, which really shouldn't. I mean, you explained really well. For each dollar you put in, you get about 140 out in investment. But why do you think, like on the House Science Committee, there's such opposition from people who are trained in the hard sciences to science education and science funding?
So the House Science Committee is problematic because they often don't understand A, science, or B, the scientific method. So many of you may have heard of Lamar Smith's recent bill that was going to basically politicize science and make it so you could not repeat any experiments, which just goes against the heart of the scientific method, which is that experiments should be repeated so we know that what we discovered is valid. And so I hope we can educate them is the best way I put it, because they need to learn about what science is and how it works. And with them, it's just not going to be easy. I mean, there's no way to put it, to be honest. A lot of them are very anti-science. I mean, we have, I go to Rice, and I was in Oklahoma yesterday, and there's a new congressman from Oklahoma, Jim Bridenstine, who graduated from Rice, where I had to apologize and say, I'm really sorry he didn't learn about science while he was at my school, because he demanded an apology from the president for funding climate science research. And he's on the House Science Committee. So it's really upsetting when it comes to that, but we'll do the best we can, vote someone out of office, hopefully, and hopefully educate the rest. That's the best we can do.
You're referring to the bill to remove funding from the peer review process, right?
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions?
I think that's all the time we have for questions, so one more round of applause for Zach Coppin, please.
I need to go 15 seconds left, because we've got time for 15 seconds. We'll go from this one. It'll be Senator Walsworth again. He's very special.
Very special.
It becomes clear he doesn't know what a molecule is.
I'll just give you the first I guess first sentence. Darwin's theory of evolution is a theory in crisis in light of the tremendous advances we've made in molecular, thank you, biology, biochemistry, and genetics over the past 50
Well,
years.
I just think you proved a point that you can't trust what you get over the internet.
So, yeah, you saw Senator Pearson walk out there. She just couldn't handle it and left after he said that. Anyway, thank you all so much.